Good morning, good afternoon from Uganda. Welcome to yet another episode of Civic Space TV's Uganda Diaspora Show. My name is Lynn, Komugisha. Ganzi, it's good to see you. Welcome to the show. Today, particularly, we are looking at a very interesting conversation that, has been all over the Remember, on March 21st this year, the Ugandan Parliament passed legislation that further criminalizes the identities and behavior of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex LGBTI people in Uganda. Among other things, this anti-homosexuality bill imposes a life sentence on consensual same-sex conduct among adults, which is already criminalized, and adds that the death penalty for so-called aggravated homosexuality, where same-sex acts involve children or people with disabilities, or where drugs or alcohol may impair judgment. Furthermore, it criminalizes activities that promote homosexuality with up to 20 years in prison, and so on and so forth. It's a lot. Well, it's not news in Uganda that the laws are against homosexuality. And our major question this afternoon or today, is it a social cultural clash or human rights violation? Ganzi, you wrote something very interesting, and I thought you'd, because coming from an African background, with what you were talking about, this thing called homosexuality, indeed, it is this thing. Where are we as a society, for example, in Uganda? And where are we going with the laws that we are putting in place as a society? Ganzi.
Thanks a lot, Lynn, and thanks everyone for having me today. Personally, I think things are complicated. They're not as straightforward as a lot of people want this debate and this discussion to be. A lot of times when contentious issues come up in society, we tend to polarize things of either you're for or against, and people talk about you're either for homosexuality or you're against homosexuality. And then there's another layer of things. You're either for African values or you're for Western values. And I think that there's just so much that has been conflated in these discussions to include things that are not necessarily homosexuality, that are bad, that we should be fighting, that we should be dealing with, but are not quite homosexuality. And so there's not been a robust discussion of what we actually are saying. I'll give you an example of when the bill talks about aggravated homosexuality. What they're really talking about is defilement, right? Defilement that just happens to be done by an adult to a minor of the same sex. Now, we already have cases, we already have laws against defilement. And so you begin wondering, what exactly is it we are trying to do? And even when we're talking about the debate, when you look at a lot of the submissions that were in Parliament, you had people talking about these are Western values. We need to promote our African values. But then if we are to be honest with ourselves, homosexuality in Uganda was not illegal until the British made it so. We have homosexuality being criminalized by the Penal Code, which was initially initiated by the British. And so you ask yourself, you have in Uganda here, we've had a history of people within the royal courts, even a Sekabaka, having been known to be a homosexual. And so when you say it is a Western value, what do you mean? In prisons, we have the prisons, the head of prisons was continually been coming to parliament to talk about the challenges they face. Homosexuality is there. Are we saying that the West somehow gets into the prisons that we have across the country and promotes homosexuality? Now, that's not to say that there aren't people who are advocating certain agendas, but I think we need to have this discussion in full, rather than just scapegoat certain people and certain things. And I think there are also discussions about our sovereignty as a country. Do we have the rights as a country to make our own decisions? Just like the US, had the right to make its decisions and elected a president who, by many counts, was everything but a promoter of human rights. Just like you had the UK having discussions around Brexit, and a lot of people thinking that these are not necessarily human rights. This is not necessarily promoting human rights. We need to have a discussion. Do Ugandans have the right? Does Uganda have the right to have these discussions and come up with decisions on their own? So I recognize a lot of things that need to be unpacked, but have not been unpacked because it's a very easy ride to say, oh, homosexuality, we are against homosexuality, we are fighting against the West, and therefore let us pass this bill. But it is beyond that. There are so many other questions. Even the bill as it is now raises so many questions that I think, I'm not a lawyer, but I think that a lot of them are very questionable in terms of how operational they can be, and how that then infringes on other rights that are guaranteed by the Constitution of Uganda.
Right, absolutely. Thank you very much, Ganzi. Now, those of you who are just joining us, we're glad you're part of us this day. Dr. Muganzi Muhanguzi Isharaza is a Ugandan researcher, academic, and communications professional, and a social commentator. Maybe a quick one because he's appearing here for the first time. He holds a PhD in media and communications from the University of Leeds, an MA in international relations from the same university, and a BA in mass communications from Uganda Christian University. He is a Christian, Anglican, and active member of his local churches, both in Leeds and Kampala. He's married to Diana Nampera, and together they have two children, Ainza and Gulimiza. Yes, so Ganzi, we're glad to have you. And joining us is, we have Dr. Kamunyu joining us shortly, but we also have Joseph Ochieno. Joseph, a very good afternoon. I hope you're in Uganda. We are talking Anti-homosexuality Bill. Is it a social cultural clash or a human rights violation? And that's the question on the table. If you've had picked a few things from Dr. Ganzi here, you might have had that we are not clear on what exactly we are fighting. Is it the acts? Is it the thought? Is it what it causes? So we are there as a country, and as much as we are standing strong and fighting for what's seemingly socially right for us as a country, there seems to be a lot that is at stake. Now, Joseph, if we could ask you, are we really fighting the act of homosexuality, or are we simply trying to consolidate being part of trying to remind ourselves of who we are culturally or socially?
We're possibly doing none of those. I must say that in the course of this discussion in the last few weeks, and I must apologize for coming late, I was just hit on the hour by a Turkish television network that insisted that I had to be their guest on the session in Sudan. I elected to 5 minutes because country, that is our neighboring country, although South Sudan has been divided into two particular communities that are part and parcel of our history. But also talking about some of these other issues, some of the issues, whatever is taking place in Sudan is a sign and a symbol of impunity of al-Bashir over a period of time, and so they're still struggling to get out of it. And finally, because it's al-Bashir and trying to get out of it, they're trying to get out of it when the al-Bashir and his team were unwilling, on the one hand. On the other, civil society groups and political groups that have been tempting to try and let themselves free. It's not surprising that they're in a stalemate, and the stalemate involves lives of African peoples. And so questions of rights and democracy. In Uganda, is my own considered opinion that it's a bungled discussion. I don't know of any legislator who has come up in recent times to give a considered and intellectual, deeply convincing case as a discussion around what homosexuality is, when it started and where it started from. There is no, and perhaps Dr. Muhwezi might come, and I know Dr. Muhwezi as a researcher, perhaps they've done some research to show and tell us how devastating homosexuality is as a vice to the culture of the people of this country, or perhaps as a national threat to our country, or perhaps a question of threat to the population of Uganda. I still believe it's none of those. My own considered opinion is that generally, when it comes to this very particular issue, for very interesting reasons, I think Africans generally are very conservative when it comes to some of these issues, particularly sexual matters. And then the question of homosexuality, as it hits the headlines, turns out that there is a feeling in Uganda that it is extremely unpopular in this country. Now, who comes the usual suspects, meaning the state, recognizing that this is a very unpopular thing. And so it is convenient for them to act swiftly on homosexuality, something that has been here since biblical times, than to speedily act on thieves who steal from our national coffers and who steal from the poorest of the poor. So I think this thing was turned into a political football. All of a sudden, the state, with a certain section of the political elite, presenting themselves, if you like, as the saviors of morality in our country, the saviors, if you like, of the family in our country, the savior of the name and the entity of the Republic of Uganda, and hence this bill. Below it really is the element of human rights, and the human rights thing is it how gays and lesbian people are treated in Uganda, or is it very much about how this is a manifestation of expression of extremes of opinion against the other, meaning the other people with whom we don't agree with, or we think they are not necessarily like us. I normally like to say this, and I will say it at the onset, that it's rather rich of this NRA regime to quickly, speedily go ahead and legislate this, however way it happened. When we know, and it's on record, Lynn, you know it, that, and people can go and Google, because every time I talk about it, people get rather excited and worried that NRA, Museveni's army, were accused and on record as having committed homosexual rape, against Acholi men when they were fighting the war of almost apparent genocide in northern Uganda. So if NRA guys did this about 20, 25 years ago, and these are Museveni soldiers, they're commander-in-chief, and we don't know where these guys came from, we don't know where they went since then, none of them was prosecuted. In my opinion, rape is much more excess sin, than basically, if you like, having an intimate relationship with a consenting adult, whatever the sex is. So who's fooling who? Lynn, unless that matter is resolved, I stand to be corrected and convinced that this is anything other than an opportunistic agenda by a regime that uses all the instruments of state, whether it's the judiciary, the executive, of course, as the whole, at the center, the legislature, and indeed before the state as the media, using public opinion, which most people in public, and which most public have no clue about even some of the things that I'm trying to talk about. So it's not surprising they now think that, well, the regime is there to protect them. Just a quick closure on this. Within the last one day, I've got a friend from a very powerful organized family, and without prejudice, not from the north, not from the west, not from the north and not from the west, but a very decent citizen from a very powerful family in this country. This person indicates that there is actually a possibility that their family member is living in a homosexual relationship with a relative of another close family member. That is something within the last 24 hours, somebody talking to me and being very, very disturbed. Now, these are guys from an extremely religious family in this country. Now, these things are known. In my language, in Tororo, Nagongera, they used to call, particularly the men, they call them Nyasigwele, the women I don't know. These are things that apparently existed around us. I did not really take big issues with it. At the moment, I possibly find drugs much more seriously dangerous than homosexuals amongst our community. What I get concerned about, yes, if there is evidence that there are people, organized cartels like mafias who steal iron sheets and mafias who control our state for 40 years, if there are mafias, people who are organized to deliberately go ahead and promote or to sell, and if you like, to influence citizens of this country towards homosexuality as an art, I would take a position as much as I would take with anybody who grooms children into sex, anybody who grooms children into drugs, anybody who grooms children into theft, and anybody who grooms children into as child soldiers. As far as put all of them together, I would actually treat them as that. For the moment, I have no idea. And then final point. Usually this thing about Bazungu, this thing coming from the West, it is absolutely true that the West, as a much more liberal society, have many of these other things in the open. It's also true that the West actually, and I saw this happen around the Blair times, ironically, in UK 25 years ago, when the idea of gay rights and gay marriages came. That, to me, is an extreme that I don't know, and I don't see how it would come up. But it was known that gays and lesbians existed, and in Britain, ironically, it came up when the Conservative Party members, and particularly parliamentarians, who were then as arrogant and much linked to impunity as NRA guys were beginning to present themselves as more godly than the Jews, meaning Jesus gods. There's relationships, sex friends started what they call them outing them. So meaning people who were dating members of parliament, male members of parliament, would come out and say, well, I had a relationship with him or her, take private videos. So it became a scandal in the 90s. And so ironically, the more this was talked about, the more this thing became a normalcy, and hence where we are today. But to suggest that homosexuality is brought into Uganda by the West, I think that is actually wrong, number one. Number two, to suggest, therefore, that we should blame the West on homosexuality in Uganda, and we cannot blame NRA on homosexual rape in northern Uganda, is a nonsense. And to suggest that, when I first knew about Nyasigwele when I was in my primary school in the 70s and early 80s in Tororo, is a misleading thing. And so the more we do that, I think the more we fail to pick on what exactly is the biggest threat as far as some of the issues of morality are concerned and how best to deal with this. At the moment, I'm not saying, again, as I said, I'm not saying that promotion of homosexuality is a good thing. I'm saying it should be dealt with. As far as I'm concerned, I believe that a matter that involves two people in their bedrooms or in their private spaces should be a matter for them. And how Uganda and the majority of Africa is going to school or to manage or to police this, I have no idea. I think it's basically an optimistic thing. Is it something I'd like to see people holding hands and hugging and kissing this on Kampala Park? No. But is it something that somebody's trying to tell me that they're being very, very nice because our moral station is at risk? I totally disagree.
Wow, those are strong views, Joseph, you have there. I don't know if Dr. Ganzi agrees with you, but before we get to Ganzi, Miriam, we have heard, it has been reported over the years that homosexuality or acts of homosexuality have been, or gayism has been here since time immemorial. And from the Roman Empire, back then, we have even seen movies, portray all these, and I want to believe that it was there before even all these, conversations started. The argument in the media or in society is that it is immoral. It is an African, yes, but it has been here. We've already had it. It was even here before we started having conversations about it. The question here is, Miriam, why are we in denial?
I think partly I would use the word ignorance or lack of knowledge of what is African or what is not African. That's what I would attribute to most of the people saying that some things are an African. If homosexuality is an African, how did people have names? I mean, there is a name for homosexuals in my language. Was that also brought by Europeans? There are homosexuals in every society in Africa dating pre-colonial days, as is in the other societies, whether they are biblical societies, the Romans, the Jews, the whites, the whatever. All mankind have had homosexuality in record. So saying that this is an African compared to the other, which is African. What is African anyway? Is it the patriarchy, the marriage, the Christian marriage? That is also an African. The idea of having like man marry one wife, whatever, that is monogamy. That is also an African, and it was brought by the British. So should we also ban that because it's an African? Excuse me, I have a cough. So the issue would be, is this practice harmful to our society? Like the previous speakers, Mr. Ochieno and Ganzi have said, homosexuals are not harmful to our society, especially as far as evidence is showing. Nobody can come out and say, hey, there was a gay person and maybe they've hurt my children or they've inflicted some sort of pain to any other person unlawfully or whatever. I've not even heard of cases in the Ugandan courts where the gays are being accused of committing crimes that are being talked about in the public today, like recruitment. Who is recruiting? It's something you hear about when you ask about the evidence. Where is the evidence? What are you talking about? It's more like the media hype, like something playing on the people. What is so clear is that there is homophobia. I mean, the fear of homosexuals. I don't know how it started, but in Africa, it's very general. Other researchers put it at like 93%. Most Africans are homophobic. I've not seen any research showing how that culture started. Did it start on the event of Christianity because Christianity came preaching against it? Was it there in a society and people were people always homophobic? I don't know where to draw the line as far as that, but you can't be homophobic where there is no homosexuals. The fact that we have homophobia shows that we had homosexuals there in society. And the question would be, are homosexuals a harm to our society? I don't think so. So why are we overreacting against them? We know they are there. Suppose it's their nature. It's that's who they are. If you produce a child and your child is gay by nature, and you have that child in your family, like Ochieno said, one of the family members was talking about their member being a homosexual. But today the law says the fact that you are a living human being and you are gay, against this homosexual bill which we have in Uganda, that's a crime. It's like you are living a crime. So if that's your nature, if you are born like that, you are already criminalized by the law. But what should you do? You kill yourself, you will do whatever. What do you do? And again, the laws in Uganda, I don't know whether it's populism. It's not funny in that usually these anti-homosexual bills, whatever happened in Uganda when something big is going on, when there is a big case of theft and corruption, that's when the politicians go in overdrive against the minorities, the LGBTIs. So it can be like a sort of a political escape for them, but they have made it a habit, and that should be noted too. So it's not about that there is a threat or something is going on. Wherever anybody wants an escape route from whatever is happening in the politics, they ride on the horse of homophobia and hyper people, because we know the people are already fear that there is homophobic already in our society. So they ride on that to cover up something big going on. So if you would relate the two issues, the anti-homosexuality bill came up when there was the Iron Sheet scandal, the NSSF scandal. We also have the Uganda Airlines probe, all those big issues where Ugandan money, the politicians are involved in, as embezzling a lot of money are involved. And it came in like a diversion, and all of a sudden everybody went on board over that because it's popular. I mean, if you're an MP and you know your constituents are homophobic, how can you denounce it publicly? I think most MPs actually vote for that, not because they believe in whatever is going on, but simply because they fear their constituents will out them for supporting something that the people don't like. So our problem, I think, is something which we need. We need more of social researchers like Ganzi coming out and telling people what this is to diffuse the homophobia, and that will make informed decisions at the political level, at the social level, even ordinary people. I pity any Ugandan who is a homosexual or LGBTI, how their life, how they will be living in fear, and how are they supposed to survive in a country like that.
Thank you indeed, Miriam, for that. This brings me back to Dr. Ganzi. Joseph earlier on hinted on the fact that this is a Bazungu agenda, of sorts. And here, Ganzi, if I were to look at a piece you wrote recently, says somewhere, I'm just picking a sentence rather, there are several problems with this narrative. First, it cannot be further from the truth to say that homosexuality is a Western value. Okay, so I would want you to expound on that. Also telling us exactly where we stand, as you are a Christian. And there's something you talk about African values versus Christianity versus global culture values. Could you put that into perspective?
Thanks a lot, Lynn. And I think, again, for me, that's where we tend to lose this debate. This debate has been had more with our hearts and passion rather than our heads and minds. And the problem with that is that we are talking about a bill being passed into law, and law doesn't deal too well with emotion and passions. So when we say we are protecting our African values, let's understand what exactly do we mean by African values. In this country, when we had the COVID lockdown, we had one of the longest lockdowns in the world. We had our schools closed for the longest period in the world. And up to today, we are having children fighting to recover from, being at home for almost 2 years. Some of them have had to repeat classes, others have had to drop out. But then there is an even larger problem that emerged from that. We had an epidemic, so to speak, of children, girls being impregnated, being forced into marriage, being made child mothers, being forced to abort, being forced to do all manner of things that a child at their age shouldn't be doing. And there's been thousands of reports. I think in the last count there were over 1 million girls who were impregnated during that period. Now, you sit back and ask yourself, when we talk about African values, are we talking about that? Because there's nothing that has been done substantially about that. A lot of these girls have been impregnated by their families, by people known to their families. A lot of these girls have been taken out of school and forced into marriage by their parents. Is that an African value? Is that something we are proud of? Is that something we are saying we are protecting? Because no one, I mean, people have said something here and there, but Parliament hasn't been anywhere near as ruthless as it has been with this bill. So you ask yourself, what are we doing as a country? Only more recently, we've had this whole issue of the Mabati saga. But then, the more you look at the inconsistencies within Parliament and the kind of laws that they are willing to pass and the ones that they are willing to sit on, the reports they are willing to discuss and the reports they are not willing to do, you begin to realize that actually this bill or act of Parliament now is more for political reasons. It is an easy win for Parliament. And you see it's unanimous across the political spectrum. It was introduced by someone who, by all purposes and intent, is in opposition. I mean, he's independent, but is more aligned to opposition than government. When in the history of this government of ours, and you know, I'm 37 years old. I've not had another. I've not seen another president. In this whole period, when have we ever seen a bill being presented by someone in the opposition and being debated and adopted by everyone, including the regime? So you begin to realize that it is something that the politicians see is an easy win, and therefore have gone for it. They debated, passed it in record time. But then you go back further to, I think, 2014, when a similar attempt was made. The same thing happened. People, you know, I think the Right Honorable Kadaga then said that this was supposed to be a Christmas gift to Ugandans. Who came against it? It was the exact regime that was telling us that they were against homosexuality, that they are promoting Christian values. Their people are the ones who went to court. Amama Mbabazi was the one who was saying, you know, the Right Honorable Amama Mbabazi was the one who was keenly advocating against the bill and against the act. And so this idea that the politicians are looking out for the ordinary Ugandan, I personally find it very hard to believe. Why are they so quick to look out for the ordinary Ugandan on something that touches far fewer people, and they are not even in Parliament to discuss when other matters of far more importance are being discussed? When we say it is an African, we are trying to promote the African values. We have a history of homosexuality on the continent. And for me as a Christian, for me, the way I see it is that if we are going to have a discussion, let us have one that is based on truth. Let us have one that is a complete discussion, that is based on the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And the truth is that as Africans, we have had several millennia of homosexuality. People, again, and I think Joseph just mentioned this in his opening remarks. People talk about this being now out of hand because there are people promoting homosexuality in schools. But my father, who passed on, you know, in 2016, when he was in school, he had incidents of people who they knew were homosexuals. You know, my grandfather, who passed on when I was about 4 years old, he, and I get these stories from my grandmother, who passed on a little later on. But they too had people they knew in the villages that were homosexuals. I think actually that part of the problem that we are dealing with, perhaps the only African value we might say is something that people might be wanting to fight for. I don't know whether it's worth fighting for, but you know, you can argue that it is an African value, is the idea of having sex kept as a private matter and not discussed or not displayed in public. That tends to be something you find in very many African communities. However, even with that, on every Friday night, Saturday night, Sunday night, you can go to any pub, to any club, to any, you know, restaurant in this country, and you will find people doing the most outrageous acts of public display of affection. You will see people basically nude. People talk about anti-homosexuality like, oh, this is immoral. But there have been manslaughter going on in this country. There are massage parlors in this country that offer sex. What are we doing about it? Absolutely nothing. There are prostitutes that are going around and servicing people, including a lot of the members in parliament. No one is going after them. So when we say we are protecting the traditional African family, how are we protecting it? By fighting people who have the right to do what they want to do as adults? When we say we are going to kill the gays, because that's what that has been the rallying cry. When we say that we are, anyone who is caught in an act of homosexuality is going to go in prison for life. Do we mean to say, or actually even the definition of homosexuality in the bill isn't clear? When, you know, if someone comes and says, I'm a homosexual, which is, I am attracted to someone of the same sex, have they committed a crime? Because the bill does not differentiate between someone who identifies as gay, for instance, and someone caught in the act of having homosexual sex. So if someone says, I am attracted to people of the same gender, does that automatically make them go to prison? And what does that mean about our freedom of conscience as provided for by the Constitution, and our freedom of association? These are questions that I said before, I'm not a lawyer, and I think Parliament would have done well consulting lawyers a little bit on this, because what we have now is just a political runabout that has absolutely no means of implementation. Are we seriously saying that we are going to be asking parents to report their children if they find out that they are homosexual, or else face jail time? If my son or my daughter were to be to come home and say, you know what, I think I'm gay, what this bill is saying is that it is a crime for me to not go to police and say, take this man or take this woman to jail. Is that African? Is that an African value that we are trying to promote? So for me, I honestly do not think that we have done a good job when it comes to defining what we mean by African values, what we mean by defending those values, and what we mean by then having a law that is supposed to be doing that. A lot of the what people are referring to as homosexuality is grooming. I would be the first person in line trying to get a bill that is against grooming, that is against getting children and forcing them into believing certain things or doing certain things that are detrimental to their health. But do not get grooming, combine it with rape, combine it with incest, and then call everything that you've just put together homosexuality. Let us have a debate that is based on truth. Let us have a discussion that is based on the reality of things, and not just these things that throw bones to the people. Because our people across the country are frustrated. They are frustrated by a lot of things. They are frustrated by the laws in this country. They are frustrated by what is happening to the economy. They are frustrated by the politics of the country. But they're also frustrated by the idea that the West tends to want to dictate to us how to live our lives. And that's again, even for people who are necessarily promoting against this bill, I think that's something that they need to concede, that we have the West trying to pressurize us as countries, as Africans, but also as Uganda in particular, to pressurize us to do things the way they want to be done. And that's an important discussion to have. Should we as a country have the right to decide and determine our own fate? But then what is the challenge with this bill is that it has got that anti-colonial rhetoric and this idea that the West is trying to manipulate us, and has tagged it to homosexuality in a very problematic way, to say that this is a Western value. I mean, 100 years ago, forget what is happening in this bill. If you went to the UK and someone identified as being gay, they would be in far more trouble than they are now in Uganda. So this idea that homosexuality is necessarily Western is actually false. There are people who were burnt on the stake because they were gay in the West. There are people who were killed. There were scientists and prominent people who were contributing to the West's development that were imprisoned, that were killed, they were castigated, and all because they were gay. And so being gay is not actually a Western value. And when we say this is something that is coming from the West, what else is coming from the West? We have in this country roads that are named after missionaries. We have in this country churches that are named after missionaries. They came from the West, and they brought to us the faith that we now hold and cherish as dear to us. Should we then now say that we should forget about everything that was brought to us by the West, including our faith? Because this idea of choosing one thing and then somehow avoiding a discussion of how it affects the other, what it does is just make us look not just foolish, for lack of a better word, but very we tend to be seen as being extremely hypocritical. And for me, until we have a robust debate about these things, it is insufficient for Parliament to come up and say we are trying to protect African values, we are trying to protect the traditional family. The traditional family that they are defining actually has never been an African family, because the traditional African family is not a nuclear family. It's not mommy, daddy, and children. The traditional African family included uncles and aunties and friends who are uncles and aunties. And so when you say you're trying to protect that, how are you doing so when you're insisting that a brother to someone who identifies as gay is committing a crime by not reporting them to police? How are you doing that by insisting that what we call Ubuntu?
He will probably get back to us shortly. But he raises a very important issue, because if you're saying you are protecting the family, as they're saying that the reason for this bill is to protect the children and youth who are made vulnerable to sexual abuse through homosexual related acts. But also, he mentioned something interesting, which they also say that the bill aims to protect the tradition of family by strengthening the nation's capacity to deal with emerging internal and external threats to the tradition of heterosexual family. I want to come to you, Joseph, and let's talk about a little bit about these legalities. Somebody is arguing that the bill, they're questioning, is the bill compatible with the Constitution of Uganda and international law in respect to human rights? That is one. Two, they're saying that this bill is, the human rights defenders are saying that the bill that says, the part where it says punishable by death is an egregious violation of human rights. I'm confused, I'm disturbed by this entire thing, because I think we are human beings before anything else. And I thought that putting in place such huge and disturbing bills or legislation, what exactly are we trying to say to ourselves? Are we less of human beings as we legislate, or are we what?
So as I said, you can see what the real priorities in this country are. The priorities are investment in infrastructure and technology, and investment in the youth of this country, so that they're able to compete with the rest of the world, including those Europeans to whom we send our begging balls, and those Europeans who, without 60% of our national budget, perhaps we would be living on stolen iron sheets and nothing else. You know, no, these things is not about the law. And you realize I'm deliberately not talking about the law per se, nor am I even about talking about Parliament as a legislative assembly. I said from the beginning, and I think all my colleagues have sort of seemingly repeated all the key points that I raised, that look, this is an opportunistic bill. This is a cover-up of people's faces, and like Miriam talked about, is very much about let's calm down the situations there. And sheet scandals. Let's calm down the situation because the NSF scandals, and let's calm down the situation because after 40 years we've got nothing major to give or deliver to our people, and after that, after 40 years, it's very difficult for us to convince ourselves and this of our communities. Of course, it's a country of the law. I rarely want to refer to the Constitution itself. Well, is parties' hands, tied behind their backs. The Constitution was designed, and the particular provisions were put to target particular individuals. No, as I say it again, Tororo in the Obola Sigweli. Now, Miriam, actually, the homophobic thing is a creation, just like any other created identity hate when they came in 1986, and I've got evidence. This homophobic thing, you're right, is something that developed over a period of time in recent times. And you're right, it goes on beyond the Republic of Uganda. And whether or not it's an African thing, I don't know. And this is the reason. The reason is this: as I was beginning to get into the realities of the world in communities and societies, and to understand sexuality and society and communities in families and things like that, I started sensing who is a 30-year-old who is, okay, not even 30, who's about 30-year-old man in the village who's not working in Kampala or in Tororo or teaching somewhere in Agongera, but who is single. People used to think about it, and people then started saying that particular individuals were Nyasigwele, and I could remember that, yes, there are cases where people would be referred to as Nyasigwele, meaning people who were known to be gay. But the point is, at no time were these people targeted for ridicule. They may not necessarily have had the respect of society because there are people who are lame, people with special needs, like these days, some funny guys who treat women who've got children but they're not married, in marital relationships, or perhaps some guys who are possibly graduates to that good jobs and they don't present it in such, certainly not in my parole. Any of these other things, and you're right, it's about homophobia. I'm not quite sure whether it is necessarily the traditionally African thing. I think it's an emergent thing, and it's an emergent thing pushed by a certain section of the media, but pushed for political interest. To the extent, therefore, that actually like is being suggested on these things about family, the traditional African family. Absolutely right. But what the traditional African family was included usually adopted children, which, you know, there were cases where people who were got as war booties became part of communities and part of clans. People who migrated to particular places, particularly many people who migrated to Uganda, being given Uganda names and picking up clans. I know a particular family, very prominent family, or not name, you know, who actually grandparents moved from Uganda, and they're now jobs, and they're very prominent jobs. You know, so these things, man, like the societies that was traditional African is actually not the bad society we got today, in which there's so much huge intolerance between a particular section in one identity, just on the basis of clan versus clan. See what happened in Rwanda, and see what, you know, happened in some other sub-regions. I don't want to talk about Miriam, I know some of these other things. See what the things that happens even in my own Padola, where people try to find themselves on the basis of clan versus the other, and see how people are battling over who's in charge of Tororo as an identity. No, this bill has got nothing to do with the traditional African society and the communities and values as they knew. The traditional African families and values, and I can say that I've got a relative advantage of age over you guys, was very caring. It was very tolerant. It was very accommodating. It was very investigative, even with the little science that they had. People tended to investigate what was wrong. What I know, what has always been traditionally rejected, you know, and detested, you know, are killers in Africa. They ostracized as society. Big thieves, those are rejected. Immoral guys, that's absolutely true. People would go ahead and express excess sex in public spaces. That was then, by and large, it is still today. That is understandable. But this excess sex, as has been presented very well by the guests before, you know, is something that you'll go ahead and pick at a Kampala club. Some of the Kampala clubs, thankfully, I am over and above average clubbing today. But when you pass down the road, you see some of the things. It's extraordinary what you see. And by the way, Lynn, in 2005, after defeating Museveni in his funny court, you know, returning to Uganda when we reclaimed multipartyism, I was in Uganda House as a resident. And one of the first outings I made in the evening with, actually, I think even Jimmy, my now other brother, Jimmy Akeda, was with us in the car. And on our way back, we passed by Grand Imperial Hotel. I'm making a very deliberate observation here. And I remember one of our lady companions, who happened to be a close friend rather than those social one, doesn't matter. But she was telling me, Joseph, we don't want you to see. What she was trying to tell me was that they didn't want us to see the prostitutes down the road. And I can tell you that I was actually genuinely shocked. And this is me, who had returned to Uganda via Lusaka, where these things also would happen, and via South Africa, where I had visited, and many other African countries, but I was coming from UK. So no, it is wrong for us to pick and choose, particularly in this case, amongst the most vulnerable. Homosexuality is not a strange thing on this continent. It's not a strange thing in the world. You can go to India, you'll hear stories about these things. This is an opportunistic move by this illegitimate regime to make itself relevant. If you care about our families, then you should make sure that our families have got guaranteed health care facilities for themselves. If you care about our families, then you should make sure that every woman who gets pregnant has got a guarantee that she will deliver a child without risk to herself and her child. And every woman who actually delivers a child has got a guarantee that the children go to school and get proper medical treatment that Museveni's children and grandchildren actually do get. If you care about the African family, then you should create possibilities that does not divide them, but make sure that our communities are united so that you don't break us into 10 little districts of 10 little sub-communities. If you care about our communities, then you should hold those police officers responsible, those who slap and push our mothers down the streets of Chikubo during COVID days, or all, including those others who push our people, including those who are in prison today, who know other reasons that families don't know. That is, if you care about our people. And then if you care about our people, then you should make sure that you take direct responsibility for the Karamojong children walking the streets of Kampala today, foodless and helpless and not knowing where they're going to appear tomorrow. That is, if you care about our people. And if you care about our people, you should account for the 10 trillion Uganda shillings that you guys loot and steal every year. That is care for this country. That to me is much more of a national security question. That is much more about the possibility of what happens in this country going forward, rather than people who express sexual desires in a manner in which they choose to be. And I can say, yes, as I say, it may be repugnant to you, but I think we need to leave them. And finally, as I said again at the beginning, I personally find it strange for people who get involved in gay relations. And you say that very openly. You know, particularly men, I find it very strange. But the point is, that is their way. And as long as they do it in the privacy of their corners, I have absolutely no problem. And by the way, if you really, really care about this, tell me those other men who were raped. In as long as the regime was responsible for people, men who raped men, in others, men who slept with men against their will, they have absolutely no moral authority to talk about this. They have absolutely no moral authority to claim that they care about the Ugandan family, and they have absolutely no moral authority to claim any possibility that whatever this bill or legislation is all about is one which is about to protect the future of not only the Ugandan family, but African family. And you know what? Many people in Acholi sub-region believe, and social scientists will say this, and researchers, that part of the reasons why there's huge challenges in Acholi sub-region is because Acholi men, chief heads of families, were humiliated in their families, raped, you know, in both ways, but in this case, in many cases, as a matter of sodomy. So no, there is nothing legalistic about these things. It is basically, and then the other thing of talk legalist, and then at the same time, you do what you do to people who come in front of parliament to basically demonstrate and express their anger and distaste against people who steal from the poorest of the poor. No, it's a contradiction. It's hypocrisy. And as I said, unfortunately, this topic is one which possibly should not be spending a lot of time in it, but it's extremely important we should, because it's a diversion.
Absolutely, indeed. It's a diversion. Joseph, you raised very important issues there. And this brings me to a question, Miriam, of so are we without values as Africans, for example? Because if we keep saying that it is an African, and then we have Dr. Ganzi saying that, what values then are you? If you're saying you're protecting the family, and then you're sidelining some other, family members, what is that exactly? Have our African or Ugandan values been eroded, that we cannot stick to what we value? Because this is the spirit of the bill. We're protecting what is African, what is ours, what is Ugandan. But then we have the likes of Ganzi, who are using their minds actually to get around these issues.
I think the question we should ask ourselves, Lynn, is what is African? What are African values? Like Ochieno has said, if it's about the family, protecting the family, continuity of mankind and all that, reproduction, which looks to be the case here, because most people are against the homosexuals, because they look at it as a discontinuity of traditional family as we know it. They look at it as a disruption of the continuity. If you have your son is gay, then you won't have grandchildren or whatever. So that's why they are discriminated against, or they are ridiculed. And it's in the same vein, like Ochieno said, in our so-called African tradition, if you are a woman and you don't get married and you don't have children, you are also going to be condemned in the same way. If you are a man and you don't get married and you don't have children, you are going to be condemned in the same way. If you are a girl, whether you are defiled or not, and you are pregnant before marriage and you have a childless father, you are going to be ridiculed, and your child is going to be treated as a bastard. So the issue is, those are the things which Africans cared about, the so-called continuity of a family in a structure they understand best. But that doesn't mean that any other person who veer from the mainstream is a criminal. So what the law says here is that, Lynn, if you are different, that's a crime, which is so wrong. You can even promote what you think is your value. For instance, if I'm a Christian, I might promote Christian values, but that doesn't mean I should condemn someone who is not Christian. Say you are a Muslim and you are also living your life, and I say you are a crime because you are not supporting my type of beliefs and my values. And that's where the problem comes in. But before we go to that, what are the African values? I seem to have a problem with that, especially since most of so-called African values today are what we borrowed from the colonial Judeo-Christian infiltration of the African. So if we are to roll back before colonialism, before the Western infiltration of Africa, what are the African values? And so far, what I remember, in, like women were not supposed to go into leadership positions. Women, you cannot eat eggs. Women, you can't do this. Are those also African values that we should look at? The people who were, if you produce a child who is mentally sick, then you are cast. You could be even, if you produce a disabled child, you could be even ostracized, or if you are a woman, you could be divorced from your family. So there is a lot of things which in our cultures, things which we are doing, yes, they were right, but there are things people were doing simply because there was a lot of they didn't have enough knowledge scientifically to understand why things were happening. So they could have maybe were averse against the homosexuals because they don't understand why a few people in our society could behave in a different way compared to the majority. And the same applied to if you say you are a woman and you are childless, they couldn't understand why one of the girls out of 1,000 cannot have children when the rest are having children. And if these are people who are valuing children more, then they look at you as an abnormal, a curse, to use the right words which were used traditionally. They look at you as a curse to the family, someone who should be discriminated against. And that's the problem. So if we are going to decolonize our African society, if we are going to readjust, remove what was printed in from the Western colonial education and whatever, and go back to African values, we still have to go back and readjust, because there were so many things done in the past that were based on lack of knowledge, especially the scientific knowledge, which were culturally acceptable at that time, but which are not culturally acceptable today. And I feel the LGBTI case belongs in that category. Same as the women were discriminated against, same as people with disability were discriminated against, etc. But before I go further, then I came about an interesting quote from Museveni in 2012. He said that homosexuals in smaller numbers have always existed in our part of Black Africa. They were never prosecuted. They were never discriminated. And this is what President Museveni said during BBC Her Talk Show in March 2012. And that's a fact. We have always had them. So the problem is, what is happening today that has changed all that? If today if you say we have always had them, that means they were homosexual. They were someone's children. They were someone's brother. They were someone's sister. And they've always coexisted with us. People might have ignored them. People might have ridiculed them, but they have existed, and we have accepted that they are part of us. And we never discriminated against them. We never hold them as a crime, because today, if your sister is a homosexual and you don't report according to this bill, you are also going to be imprisoned for 6 months for not reporting your sister who was born gay, lesbian. That's the new law. That's what the law said. Or if an MP today, one of these MPs who could have made the law, tomorrow their child could turn out homosexual. Are they going to report that kid? Like Ganzi asked earlier, are you going to report your kid to be, they might even face the death penalty because this law also takes it that far. So the issue is, and then I don't want to repeat what Ochieno has said, the current issues, which is also right. Politically, we should be focusing on more urgent things, and that's the reality. But going back to the anti-homosexuality bill, when there is the word "anti," what is, if we acknowledge that these people exist in our society, what are their rights as human beings today? If today you are a Ugandan and you are homosexual, what are your rights? And who is going to protect your rights? So as we are very busy talking the anti-homo, what about pro-homo? Who is going to stand for them? Who's going to advocate for them? Because part of these laws, they are saying if you are a civil society and you advocate for the rights of the LGBTI, you are also going to be banned, you are also criminalized. If you are a journalist, you are a reporter, and you report an incident where the homosexual is being abused or being discriminated against, or if you say something about them, then you are also going to be criminalized. I mean, who is going to speak for them? So we are pushing a certain number of people, they might be the minorities, but into a dark corner. We are actually wishing them dead or whatever. I don't want to say dead, but the law says death penalty. We are wishing them non-existent, but they exist. Like I even quoted the president, he said they exist so far today. So what is going to happen to them? Oh, today I was even wondering, say, these people, if the law says you are going to be arrested because you identify as gay or whatever, which prison are they going to put you into? Because we acknowledge they don't exist. Where are they going to keep you? Are they going to wish you disappear from the face of the earth simply because they don't understand you, or they feel you don't belong? Excuse me. So those are the issues we should be thinking about.
Yes, indeed, and this reminds me of the UNAIDS executive director, Winnie Byanyima. She was recently asking, so what happens to their medical services? Because they're human beings, they equally need medical attention. And so how are you going to go about it? It was a whole lot, because she also delved into how this is going to erase the good that has been done in the fight against HIV/AIDS, because they equally get, they need help here and there. So it is deep, it is raw, and it is very interesting. I was reading somewhere, and I see that our deputy Speaker of Parliament, when he was in the African, Caribbean, Pacific States Parliamentary Assembly, he mentioned that we are not going to trade African values for European money. Now, this brings in the very interesting beat, because some sections of the public argue that we are going to suffer as a country because we are passing laws that are going to, take away the monies coming in from our donors. And Ganzi, this brings me to you. Really, because we're already questioning the fact that what are these African values? If they're going against human rights, what are these African values? What exactly what they are? And so we're asking ourselves, we need the donors, we need the international recognition, or some sense of being part of the global culture, or global growth and everything. But here we are creating things that are against the global culture. The question here, Dr. Ganzi, is how are we preparing ourselves for the effects these laws have on us?
Thanks a lot, Lynn. And sorry, my network broke off earlier on. For me, actually, I'm not particularly interested in talking about the Western donors and money coming or not coming, because I don't think that should form the basis of public debate and public policy. We should not come up with laws based on whether we are going to get money or not. And it is because of that that in some sense I understand why a lot of Ugandans are up in arms, because when the president of the US comes up and tells us that, you know, there will be serious consequences if you pass this law, even me, my knee-jerk reaction is to say, hold on a second, who are you? You know, because just a few years ago, the US had a president that couldn't even properly pronounce the country Namibia. A few years ago, we had a president of the US who was calling countries like mine shithole countries. When we talk about having the donors reduce the money, or the donors saying they are going to cut aid, personally, I don't think that's where the debate should be, because there are a lot of things, there are a lot of decisions we need to take as a country that might not necessarily be in the interests of the US or their foreign policy or the West. And we should go ahead and take them if they are in our interest as a country. So for me, I don't think that's a good debate to have. What we should be asking ourselves, though, is that in this particular matter, what good are we getting out of passing this law as a country? Forget about what the West thinks, forget about what, you know, our trade partners are saying, or the international community, the Western media. Let's for a moment forget about it, because that's what everyone is clamoring for us to do anyway. What are we saying about ourselves as a country when we pass this law? For starters, the reality is that it's not going to be operationalized. No one is going to, because the way you can operationalize this is by allowing police to get into people's bedrooms, or put on CCTV cameras in all the motels and all the hotels around, or put CCTV cameras in the bedrooms of people. That's the only way you're going to, you know, actively be able to prove and definitively be able to prove someone was having you know, homosexual sex, or someone wasn't having homosexual sex. Because all the other things that you might be able to do, you know, someone was holding hands with another human being, or another man, or two women were holding hands, that's circumstantial, and it cannot pass, you know, in court. I don't see how that would be tantamount to acts of homosexuality. So what we want as a country needs to be defined and needs to be guided by who we are as a nation. And I'll tell you a story of, I have a friend of mine who happens to be gay. You know, he's homosexual. He's also a Christian. And his journey to become a Christian got him to a point where he read the Bible and talked about, and looked at the literature that he looked at, and came to the conclusion that God views homosexuality as a sin. And so he said, as a Christian, he decided that he was going to stay celibate. He was not going to engage in sex, because he was not attracted to women, or did not feel attracted to women on the one hand, and on the other, if he carried out what he was attracted to, he felt that he would be going against his own faith. And so he's in his late 50s now. He has not had any, or at least he says he has not had any sexual relations for quite a lot of time, a couple of decades. And he identifies both as Christian and as a homosexual, i.e. someone attracted to people of the same sex. He's not a Ugandan, but I wonder that if you are to put that person in this country called Uganda, what would be our response to that? Would we call this person someone worthy of death because he's a homosexual, because he's attracted by people of the same sex? Or would we be saying, oh, no, he has done the right thing by abstaining? If we are saying that, if you're out there and you're watching this and you're saying, yeah, he did the right thing, then I would put it to you that your problem isn't even about whether someone is homosexual or not. Your problem is whether that person has sexual relations or not. And I would like to, and at that point, you need to question yourself and say, what is it about me that makes me so obsessed about another person having sex or not, right? What is it about me being so interested in what another human being has had to gratify himself sexually? Now, again, like I said in the article I wrote, there are people, if we're having this conversation, let's have a full discussion. There are people who are in heterosexual marriages or heterosexual relationships, and they prefer to have, I don't know how explicit we can be on this show, so please guide me on how explicit we can be on about this, and do let me know if you think that some of these discussions are inappropriate for this show. But there are people who are in heterosexual relationships that prefer to have anal sex. Is that homosexuality? Is that not homosexuality? Because again, when you talk to Ugandans, they seem to be so obsessed about anal sex or sex between one man and another, as if that the only way you can have anal sex is within a homosexual relationship. But there are a lot of people, and I know some of them, who actually have that kind of sex, and they are in heterosexual relationships. So for me, again, I think that we need to have a conversation as Ugandans, talking to each other and talking to each other frankly. I think there is grounds for the church in Uganda to have a robust discussion about whether homosexuality is a sin or not. And I think that is right and proper. And I'm happy to engage in that debate with fellow Christians. I happen to think that, there's no way that you can read the Bible and come off with the idea that homosexuality is not a sin. It is a sin from a biblical point of view. But at the same time, there are a lot of sins in this country that are not punishable by death. There are a lot of people who are committing adultery in this country. Adultery isn't, it can be a reason for getting divorced, but no one is going to prison because of committing adultery. There are people in this country that engage in sex before marriage. If you're a Christian and you really believe all these things that we are hearing in the pulpits, as you should, then sex before marriage is inappropriate, it is sinful, it is not God's way. Who are you going to put in prison for having sex before marriage? If you're saying, okay, my problem with homosexuality is that it is very unchristian, I need to see the consistency in that argument applied to other areas of our lives. If we are saying that if you're Muslim and you're saying anti-homosexuality rather homosexuality is against Islam, I want to see you go around imprisoning everyone that eats pork in this country, because it is against your faith. And so you find that we are in a situation where we are now using the West and saying, oh, the West and they might take our money or take funding away from us. But even if they did, whether they did or not, the discussion and the argument for this bill lacks any merit. And like, both Joseph and Miriam have mentioned, there are a lot of things that we are facing as a country that need to be dealt with that are far more important. When Uhuru Kenyatta, the former president of Kenya, was hosting Barack Obama, the former president of the US, in Nairobi, they had a joint press conference in which the media asked Uhuru Kenyatta, because of course the issue of the LGBT community was one of those that was very close to the administration of Barack Hussein Obama. And so they asked Uhuru Kenyatta, so for you, what do you think about this? Do you think that Kenya should be more liberal? And he gave an answer. I think it was both politically correct, but also very real. His response was this. He said, look, we have a lot of things that we share in common with the US. We have a lot of things that are different. We have cultures that are similar and we have cultures that are different. But also as a country, as Kenya, they are grappling with so many things: maternal health, infant mortality. They're grappling with poverty. They're grappling with insecurity. And he said, as a country, they feel there is so much on their plate that they would rather prioritize those things that matter to the everyday person on the street. And perhaps at a certain point, when they have dealt with these more critical things, they might have time and space to discuss these other things. Now, I think that he said that to avoid a direct discussion of this, but it is nonetheless a very accurate thing, and that's something that I would have hoped that our parliament and our leaders would do. That we focus on ensuring that we do not have people in government that think it is right and proper to get iron sheets meant for the poorest of the poor and put them in their personal farms. Let us focus on that. Let us focus for a minute on ensuring that we have in government people who actually do what they say they are going to do, and if they don't, have the dignity and sense of humility to resign. Let us focus on ensuring that when my mother or my wife or my sister or my cousin gets pregnant and wants to give birth, it is not a life-threatening condition. That pregnancy in this country does not mean a very real possibility of death. Let us focus in this country on ensuring that if someone does not agree with the government and wants to go and protest, as the Constitution allows them to, that they can do so without fearing that they are going to be put in remand for years on end without being tried. Let us focus on ensuring that we have in government people who are actually going back to their communities, asking them, what do you want and what do you need? And then going back to parliament and ensuring that the needs of the everyday person are being addressed, are being met, and are being discussed in the August House. What we are having now is people who have failed to do what they should be doing and have decided to do things that will give them some popularity, but are absolutely nothing and do not affect anything that the local person, the everyday Ugandan, is facing their everyday life. And so I want to also conclude on this note. I have seen and I've heard and I've had people talk to me personally. In fact, the day before yesterday, I was having a discussion with a very prominent person in this country who was okay, I was going to say something, then I realized that it might be used to identify that person. So, but they're a prominent person who have been in government. And they were telling me, you know, I support this bill, but the reason I support it is because I'm worried for our children. I'm worried for the future that they are having, and I'm worried that, and I'm acting out of fear because I feel like the West has this whole agenda that it is forcing us to take, and I don't know what to do. And I remember what I told her, this person is that, you know, we cannot afford as a country to pass laws based on fear. We cannot afford as a country to pass laws that are based on our fear of what might be. We have to be more intentional. And what that means is that we need to sit and have robust discussions about, okay, what do we need to do to protect our children from being groomed? Let us have a bill in parliament about grooming. Let us have serious consequences for people who go around grooming our children. Okay, let us have a discussion about about laws that protect our children from pornography, which means that there are going to be clubs in this town that are closed, that there are going to be places in this town that are closed. Let us have a discussion in this country about what our children access and when they access it. But this, you know, this haphazard picking of things that that's based on what is popular with the base and what will give me a quick win and make me look like I did not just recently take money to remove term limits. Let me get this next bill that protects me and ensures that I get into the next parliament. Those kind of things should not be expected of our leaders, and we as Ugandans should see right through it. And I'll tell you for a fact that this bill, after it has been passed, I doubt that it will be signed by the president into law. But even if he signs it into law, I can guarantee you that there are going to be people in this country, people in the regime, in the government, that will go to court. Not the West, not the, you know, these people who are so-called sponsoring homosexuality, but people in the government itself are going to go to court, and court is going to squash this law, just as it did 8 years ago. Why? Because this law was never really meant to be a law that was passed. It was meant to be a discussion that endears the discussants, i.e. the MPs, to the people that elected them to do serious business and are now in parliament talking about what people do in their private bedrooms and are unable to discuss the things that actually matter.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Ganzi there. Now, as we begin to wind up on this conversation, because we're starting on the downhill as we get to wind up, I come to you, Joseph. Somebody is writing and saying that they can see that two sides are militating against each other over global cultural values. And they go on to say, on one side, we have LGBT rights activists and human rights groups around the world, aligned with liberal and humanist movements. On the other, American evangelicals and other conservative religionists, homophobic populists, assaulted politicians from the global south and China and Russia lacking behind the dust. Do you agree, Joseph?
No, as I said from the beginning, it's really all in between this. And it's true, yes, that the evangelicals in the Americas linked to Donald Trump, and I wish Africans knew whom Trump were, and whom Trump was, whom Trump is, and whom Trump and what Trump actually represents. If they did know that, like I think my colleague, Dr. Ganzi, just sort of seemingly suggested earlier, it would be very surprising that there's an African who would kneel and even fight over a pub in Kampala, who is much more ardent supporter of Donald Trump as it was, just like some Africans who followed like blindly what Brexit was, when all these are programs which are basically by and large anti-African. To the extent that this regime, including led by Mr. Museveni, who's basically Nyampala for many of these foreign interests, if only people knew what really these guys were all about. You know, African priorities closest to what President Kenyatta said, and directly as suggested by Miriam and I, and indeed Dr. Ganzi from the beginning, that our priorities are big. Our priorities should be reorganizing our families, reorganizing our communities, investigating our own culture, finding where we're able to grow them, finding those that we can dump, finding those where we can work together, pushing for inventions, mobilizing our resources to make sure that we add values to our minerals, which are massively exploited by Trump and their agents. We would not be having this conversation, in part because our exchequer, our exchequer, meaning our budgets would be self-sustaining. We would be able to cater for what we need. We would not be, partly because of those failures. This is where we are. Now, for the Russians and for the Chinas, and we are the ones who... Sorry?
We keep losing you. You're breaking.
What do you say? I'm interested put for the agenda. As far as African's case, I think it's a primary network in Kampala. I mean, a very relatively established part of Kampala, and if you cannot get network here, then you can imagine what's happening in Atiak or somewhere in Chinoni, and yet here we talk about gay sex. But look, so really, the African elite, in this case, Miriam leading, we need to support that we have been interested, mobilize and organize ourselves. That's basically the point I was trying to make. So that we begin to put on our own national tables agendas that push our national interests, our community's interests, our African identity interests, or indeed what Mr. Museveni does push on behalf of the Trumps. On this particular occasion, they have picked on something that they think it will keep them around, because the majority of the African men, that there's a powerful African whose name we would always get from Dr. Ganzi, says that they are concerned about their children. So if you see the people at the minimum threat of homosexuality, what are urgently required in this country, it tells you that the elite, just like the state, has been substantially captured by self-interest, both at Kampala. That I generally also agreed with some of the concerns with this. That I told you the trajectory around these debates in particular in the UK, where in the 90s their backroom sex mates started outing them in the media, and 10 years later, homosexuality became a normal. I'm not comfortable, and the overdrive of which is that compelling the church to have what they call gay marriage. That to me is actually anti-biblical, and in many cases not surprising. Maybe I'm just bringing a new line here, because maybe in Uganda overreacting, because as I said, gay marriages, number one. And then number two, where, say in this case, maybe gay men or perhaps lesbians say that they're attracted to same sex and they even go ahead and get married. But go ahead and then it's their right to have children. It's their right to have children. And so therefore, demand that the law should entrench itself to ensure that they go ahead, in this case, maybe two gay men, go ahead and look for some maybe vulnerable young woman, or perhaps, of course, surrogacy is neither here nor there, and then they say, we are going to have a children. Those are two normally, those two have been my discussion over the years, as far as the homosexual debate is concerned, whether I'm here in Uganda, anywhere in Africa, or generally across Europe. I'm saying also that I think the state of homophobia, as Miriam would say, amongst many Africans, that where these guys are treading into our spaces. And possibly even the Western media may have found themselves blackmailed. Western political establishment finding these guys investigate and test things in court. And once that become passed as the legislation.
Sorry, we just lost Joseph there. Miriam, I come to you, and this is the question we're asking ourselves today, and because we are starting to wind up in this conversation. Sorry, Joseph, we lost you. We'll get back to you on that. Is it a social cultural clash, or have we concluded it is a human rights violation?
I would say it's both. I think what we are dealing with, like Ganzi said, is something which we need us to sit down and discuss. What are African values? What is good for us as Africans going forward? We know in our culture we had some things like Joseph said, which are good and bad, and what should we promote? Ideally, cultures grow, and when they grow, some of the things they leave behind and adopt new things. So cultures are never static. For instance, the British, I think the monarchy never had like they are trying to marry like to have a divorced wife being married in the family for the first time. You know, some things we've grown seeing things change. So if our culture is going to prosper, we should be having this discussion. The problem with Africa today, to be brief, is that we tend to accept whatever is coming from the West as the ideal, as the good, as the new norm. Then when that thing is not good, like we see now the backlash against the LGBTIs, then we cry and go back and say, oh, what was African culture? And then where did we leave that discussion before? Like today, if you ask any child in school, how many children know what African culture is, or their culture, their language, their taboos, their values, their beliefs? Where did we leave that discussion? And why do we have to rush back there when it's convenient? And when it's not convenient, we forget all about it. So if we are to uphold whatever we think is good for Africa, can we go back to our culture, pick out the good, and see what we can integrate it with the modern cultures? Because some of them are good. Most of the practices are really good, like the liberation of women, the children's rights, protecting children against said defilement, or if their fathers are going to marry them off when they are young. You know, there are things which are really good and we should be embracing. But then there are things which we need to see, how do we embrace this change as Africans? Is it going to disintegrate whatever we hold dear? How do we move forward? Today, if you have a Ugandan child and you have really brought them to be homophobic and you notion the gays, tomorrow if they go into the global community, how are they going to behave? How are they going to relate with other people who have different perceptions about the same group of people, the gays? So we have to put that into consideration. And as Ganzi said, we also need to engage in our media. What do we want our children to watch? Must they see everything? If you go on internet, everything happening from other countries is invading our space, and the children are accessing all that. So if we are ready to protect our society, can we have that discussion and like this anti-homosexual bill? It shouldn't have been a law. It should have been a discussion. Yes, there is a concern, but what is that concern and how do we deal with it? But back to the law, Lynn, this law, if it's passed, it's still a bill, and if it becomes a law, we should also not forget, when we talk about human rights, we shouldn't forget about the negative part about it. This law can be used by the state or anybody to criminalize or to persecute innocent people. For instance, today, Lynn, I can say you are in a homosexual or lesbian relationship, even if I don't have evidence. You know, our laws can arrest you on suspicion. You could be detained, and it can be used against opposition leaders. It can be used against your neighbor. If someone wants to grab your land, it can be used against innocent people who have rivalries against other people. So this law is so bad, and any bad law shouldn't be in our books. And our parliament was really wrong to pass such a harmful law which can hurt all innocent people, including the LGBTI, but going beyond any other person assumed LGBTI and can be persecuted based on that law. And it's so tough, it even has a death penalty. There are very few laws in Uganda which go as far as having a death penalty as a form of punishment. So that law, our parliament actually is responsible even to go to that extent of passing something as hurtful as that, as far as human rights are concerned. But when it comes to our social cultural values, yes, there is a clash. There is always been a clash. When women, when there was a debate to liberate women, to ensure women's rights, the African conservatives thought it was a clash against the African family, because a woman was seen as a person to reproduce, to grow food, feed their children, stay home, cook, feed, and stay there. So even the effort to liberate women itself was a conflict of whatever was thought to be African culture versus the Western. So they thought liberating a woman was a Western culture. But even before colonialism, African women were liberated, and some of them were leaders. So as a Pan-African, for me, I see a very big conflict of what is real African, like the pre-colonial African. So if we are to decolonize our discussion and remove that blanket of colonial invasion of ideas, what is real African? But most importantly, we should also put into consideration what is good for African today going forward. What is good for African today as part of a global community? What is good for African children, for African families, for African governments, for African peoples, and what can develop our community?
Yes, indeed. And Dr. Ganzi, the final question here, of course, the biggest question here is, truly, is it a social cultural clash or a human rights violation? Already we are seeing that sinners are judging fellow sinners for sinning differently. So surely, what do you make of this conversation as we wind up in your concluding remarks?
So I think the question is framed in a very either or kind of way. And it goes back to what I said at the start, which is that we need to unpack the things we say and what we mean by what we say. When we say, is it a social cultural clash? What do we mean? When we say, is it an issue of human rights? What do we mean? You know, the way not just Africans, but Ugandans in particular interpret and activate human rights is going to be different from the way someone in another country does. So that's a given. And I've heard a lot of people who are promoting this bill say, you know, let's do it our way. We can't be. to an extent, I agree that the way we interpret and understand human rights is going to differ from from one country to another. At the same time, I think that we need to appreciate that culture, like Miriam just said, is not static. Culture changes. The last time we had this debate around an anti-homosexuality bill, the president, President Museveni, in an interview, was asked about his views, and he said, African culture, public display of affection is a problem. Like, you will never see me kissing Mama, meaning Honorable Janet Kata Museveni. Will not hold hands in public. So his argument was that is not an African way of doing things, and therefore the bigger issue here isn't even that homosexuality is a thing or not a thing. It is more that public display of affection and public display of sexuality, or even public discussion of sexuality, was un-African. I remember that because it was very funny to me, and I was discussing that with my wife when we were watching that interview, because it sounded completely out of touch with the youth of Uganda, who happen to form the majority of Ugandans. Public display of affection is now a lot more common in Uganda than it was, when the president was youthful. And so beyond social and social cultural issues and human rights, I think there is also an issue of age. And over time, things have come to change. We no longer have, there are people who, I remember when we were growing up, the idea of cohabiting, particularly if you were in a very Christian setting, was very problematic. And, people would say, this one is not married. Today, the vast majority of Ugandans are in cohabiting relationships, those that are in relationships. And it is very normal for them to be so. Again, it is an age difference. It is a generational issue. So for me, I think that if we are, and I think I've said this over and over again, if we are going to have a debate about homosexuality, I don't think we should, because I don't think it's such a big issue. But if for some reason the majority of people say we need to have a debate, then by God, let's have a debate that is thorough and balanced and discusses things in their totality. Let us tell the story properly. Let us not have what has happened, which was in a matter of 1 week, a law being tabled, discussed, and passed. When there have been laws and bills that have been presented to Parliament that are far more important, that have sat in that Parliament, and in fact, entire sessions have ended, 5 years have ended without them being discussed. Let us have robust discussions of what it means to be African, what it means to, when we talk about traditional African families, what it means to say African values. And once we have a robust discussion of that, we might then say, okay, among the things we have identified as African values, which are the key things we need to promote? And which are the key things, which are the things that are not so important that we can discuss at a later point, but this is urgent. And I think if we prioritize things in that order, we will find ourselves agreeing that this bill has no place in the current Parliament. There are far more important things to discuss. There are far more important issues to deal with. There are far more important and far more, there are laws that have far deeper repercussions that should be front and center of our debate and our discussions, both in Parliament and in our dining tables at home.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Ganzi. And Joseph, finally, as we conclude in your concluding remarks, could you hear me out? Somebody says future historians will reference the developments around Uganda's anti-homosexuality law as a textbook example of a proxy battle fought within the ongoing cultural world of our time, a legal and political confrontation in a remote African theater between local actors connected through tracks of social, political reflexology to global stakeholders.
Look, no, I think that submission is too intellectual for this debate. I would also submit that it's possibly, is it a cultural clash? It's not. Culture, which culture versus which? As we said before, this is, in conclusion, this is a matter that something that has been with us since the beginning of time. It's a European thing, it's an African thing, it's an Asian thing, and in particular, actually quite active in Asia, as I used to be told in the 80s when we at Makerere, as we talked as students, and is very much of a Scandinavian issue, just as it's the Caribbean issue, and so is it something that is a matter, of course, in the Holy Land called Israel. And the Holy Land extended to Israel, including those people who would go for the Quranic life of Islam. So this is a global issue. Now, I remember, contrary to what Ganzi is saying, when we actually primary school kids up to our secondary schools, it was actually quite common for boy friends to hold hands in this country, whether it was in Nagongra boys or it was in Miri, and it was actually not a problem. So some of these issues of perception posed by the media, and you could say a progression of how particular groupings and particular interests push agenda and then normalize them or perhaps criminalize them on the other. The other thing is that what Mr. Museveni says, I disagree. I don't know how deep Mr. Museveni's heritage is in Ankole. In the 80s, when I came to Kampala from Miri and started attending high school, one of the few things was the manner in which the Manyankole, Westerners, but particularly Manyankole, without prejudice, expressed affection. I found it strange as a Jaluo from Tororo that a mother-in-law, for instance, would hug a daughter-in-law, or a father-in-law would hug, kill what is actually people around our country. The more affection I show. So, so affection, yes, some cultures don't, but traditionally, Westerners did this. Now, I find it very strange that for me as Ochieno, I would walk in the streets of Kampala, coming to meet you for dinner, Lynn, and I don't hold hands. Actually, if I were president, and who knows what happens in 50 years' time, and I was in the State House in Tebe, I would have affection with my wife, but show young men and young women how wonderful it is to actually show the mother of the nation the best of what you can provide. So if Mr.
Joseph, we are losing you, and would like to hear your, concluding remarks.
For whatever reason, I rejected it. As we conclude this subject, this conversation, do so. Then as legal concerns and constitutional concerns and not being handled properly by the state. This, as I said, is a diversion, and it's up to the Ugandan elites to mobilize and organize not only against this, but to expose the fact that it is time for us that going forward across the political divide, meaning opposition political parties, as NRA, have issues like this to discuss at strategic policy levels. Academia discuss this at policy level. The media critique these things, so that by the time these things become matters of legislation, legislators are sufficiently informed that they make informed decisions. And so therefore, when they become genuine legislation in matters of law, people know that this is a matter of genuine national concern, meaning that people in Chinoni, people in Uganda, people in Kotido, people in Kisori, as well as people naturally in Nagongra would have been involved. In as long as it has not been, and it's a hearsay, then as I said, this is a fudge, it's an NRA fudge, and I think it's a waste of public resources as much as 40 billion was the waste of public resources in the interest of a few people under any regime.
Very interesting conversation we've had. Miriam, Joseph, and Dr. Ganzi, I thank you very much for this time. And I hope we can have more of these conversations and understand really where we are headed. But most importantly is that we are focusing on things that are really non-essential at the moment. Because we are humans. Everybody has a right to do whatever they want, as long as they're not infringing on my rights. And if they're doing it, I think we need to find level ground as people. For me, I believe with this, I want to, in a way, understand that surely we are diverting from what's important to things that are not that important to focus on. But you don't know. What is important to me might not be important to my nation. So surely. Thank you so much. I wish you all a lovely weekend and hope to catch you again some other time.